Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Al-Shabaka's Policy Labs. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nadim Bawalsa. I'm the commissioning editor at Al-Shabaka, and I'll be taking over from Al-Shabaka policy analyst Nur Arafe as the facilitator of our policy labs. It's an honor to be with you today, facilitating this discussion about a very timely and important topic, the upcoming Palestinian elections, real change or reality check. Starting on the 22nd of May, and for the first time in 15 years, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza will elect their leaders. Indeed, for the first time in 15 years, the Palestinian Authority will have to defend its legitimacy and political power amid shifting domestic, regional, and global realities that threaten its very existence. But the long-awaited Palestinian general elections, which include elections of the legislative and executive branches and of the Palestinian National Assembly, are wrought with factionalism, external influence, and corruption. Who are the leaders and political bodies Palestinians will be voting for? How are the elections affected by external stakeholders? Who are these stakeholders? Given the ongoing Israeli occupation and the deepening fragmentation of Palestinian civil society, can we hope for these elections to bring about significant change? Joining us to discuss these questions and more are two of Al-Shabaka's policy analysts, Diana Buttu and Munir Nuseibah. Diana Buttu is a lawyer who previously served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team and was part of the team that assisted in the successful litigation against the apartheid wall before the International Court of Justice. She frequently comments on Palestine for international news media outlets, and she serves as a political analyst for Al Jazeera International. She maintains a law practice in Palestine, focusing on international human rights law. Munir Nuseibah is a human rights lawyer and academic based at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, Palestine. He's an assistant professor at Al-Quds University's Faculty of Law. He's the director and co-founder of Al-Quds Human Rights Clinic, the first accredited clinical legal education program in the Arab world, and the director of the Community Action Center in Jerusalem. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us today. So I'd just like to give our audience an idea of the format for today's Policy Lab. For the first 30 minutes of the lab, I will pose some questions to Diana and Munir related to the topic. During the second half of the lab, Diana and Munir will answer questions from you. Throughout the discussion, please submit your questions, any questions you have that come up during any time of the Policy Lab, by clicking on the Ask a Question link at the bottom of the page. And remember that you can vote on the questions you'd like asked. So let's get right to it. Diana, I'd like to ask you first, and if you don't mind, I'd like to start with something of a two-part question. Given your expertise and knowledge in this issue, can you give us some insights into why you believe these elections are happening now? And why has it taken so long for them to happen? Then, can you share with us your thoughts on whether these elections are actually significant for Palestinians, given the ongoing realities on the ground, the occupation, the political division, societal fragmentation, and of course, the changing regional and global political realities that we witness?
Thank you very much, Nadim. And I want to thank Al-Shabaka. It's an excellent network. I'm very honored to be a part of Al-Shabaka. And I also want to just spend a very quick thanks to Munir as well for being with me as a co-panelist. It's very much an honor. To answer your questions, they're very good questions. The why now and is it significant? The why now is a little bit complicated. In terms of why now, there has been a great deal of sustained pressure that has been brought to bear on Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority in order to hold these elections. Now, we've seen that over the course of the past 15 years that much of this has been held up because of the split between Hamas and between Fatah. And still to this current day, people are still demanding that they see reconciliation even before we have elections, that reconciliation is not a replacement for, elections, excuse me, not a replacement for reconciliation. And yet, even though we are seeing what we're seeing in terms of this sustained pressure, it's important to bear in mind that what Mahmoud Abbas is doing is not actually full wholesale elections, but actually just fragmented elections. And what do I mean by this? If you first look at the way that those who are eligible to vote, it's only those Palestinians who are actually present in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip who are over the age of 18, who are eligible to vote. And so that, of course, leaves aside a whole host of the electorate, including Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, Palestinians who don't have residency, Palestinians who are in the diaspora, Palestinians in refugee camps, and so on. But even if you accept that as being that elections need to be territorial, which I don't accept, but even if you go down the premise that elections need to be territorial, what Abu Mazen has done over the course of the past, since the election announcement happened in January, was to really start to whittle down the class of people who are actually eligible to run in these elections. And so this becomes very important. One of the laws that he's passed, on the one hand, he passed a law talking about the need to have freedom of expression and enshrining the freedom of expression. And yet, on the other hand, he's passed a series of presidential decrees that have the effect of law, whereby he actually narrows down the scope of those who are eligible to run. And so how has he done this? First is he has put age limits on the people who are eligible to run as candidates. The current age limit now is 28 years of age. So if you think of somebody who is under the age of 28, somebody who from their early 20s onward, they don't have the ability to run in these elections. The second thing that he's done is that he's also put limits on who can run by making sure that people who were formerly members of the Fatah Central Council or the PLO Executive Committee are also not eligible to run. And current employees of the Palestinian Authority, which number close to 200,000 individuals, are also not eligible to run unless they resign from their posts. Now, these are things that on their face look they look simple, they look easy. But when you think of the fact that we've had 15 years of not having elections, the idea that you're now going down the path of limiting who can actually vote who can actually run is quite a scary proposition. Instead of pushing for a continuation or growth of these political parties, he's actually trying to cut them off. And it's important to keep in mind that in Palestine, there actually isn't a way to register a new political party. There isn't a political parties law that allows Palestinians to be able to develop a new political party. So what in effect we're looking at is the existing parties that are in place and his attempts to limit those individuals who can run in those elections. It's not just an age limit, it's not just an experience limit, but there's also other limits. For example, in order to register a list, it's going to cost $20,000. Now, in a time when we see the devastating impacts that this occupation has wreaked on Palestinians, the fact that he's demanding these sums of money to be able to even put your foot into the door to run is in effect excluding people who are younger, in effect excluding people who may want to establish something new and different, and really at its core about limiting any form of dissent. Just today, for example, we heard that the former foreign minister, Nasser Qudwa, was somebody who's just been kicked out of Fatah because of the fact that he is seeking to establish another list. So the why of this is that there is sustained pressure, but in order to alleviate that sustained pressure, he's going down the path of making sure that these elections are actually tailored to have the outcome that he wants to have, where it's only certain individuals who are allowed to run, people who are technically not going to be opposing him, making sure that There's financial limits, making sure that people who are current members of the Palestinian Authority cannot run, all in an attempt to really try to limit any form of political dissent. Now, one final thing just to note is that in establishing this election as well, he's also changed the rules of the game. In the past, where we used to have a list where 50% of the slate was based on you choosing a list, and then 50% were individuals who were voting from the districts, he's since also changed that so that it's now also a threshold list, so that you have to pass a certain percentage of the threshold in order to be able to get a certain number of seats. In effect, what he's doing is killing off any grassroots movements, any grassroots organization, in order to say that there are elections happening and that the Palestinian Authority is moving forward. The dangerous part of this is that just in the same way that the 2006 election, the aftermath of the 2006 election, set the precedent for the international community to ignore the election results, my fear is that this is also setting the precedent of being able to tailor make elections to suit your own purposes.
I'm sorry, my microphone got stuck. Thank you, Diana. I think what you've really shown us is just something of a sobering reality about what really is at stake here when we talk about elections, and whether or not this is truly an election system in place. I'd like to get deeper into that, actually, and Munir, turn to you for a minute. Given the crippling occupation and the polarizing division in Palestinian leadership that is ongoing, that we've seen for the last 15 years, as well as the radically different realities for Palestinians within historic Palestine and throughout the diaspora, all of this raises concerns about the legitimacy and the representativeness of these elections. Can you tell us more about this crisis of legitimacy, as you have called it, and how you see it impacting the elections? Diana gave us a bit of insight into this, but if you don't mind telling us a bit more about your perspective on the legitimacy of these elections.
Thank you, Nadim, and let me also thank you and thank Diana for this event, and thank Al-Shabaka as well. It's an honor to be with you. Now, regarding your question, let me start by actually following up one thing that was noted by Diana in her answer to your question now, which is the consequences of the 2006 elections. The 2006 elections happened. The Palestinian people chose a certain choice. This was not only rejected by the traditional Palestinian leadership of the Palestinian Authority, but also by the rest of the world, mainly, the Western world, the donors of the Palestinian Authority. And this actually crippled the Palestinian Authority for the period following this election. The Palestinian Authority could not pay any salaries to its employees. Israel imprisoned a number of the Legislative Council members, and also revoked the residency of those who were elected from Jerusalem, and some of those who were elected from Jerusalem, and transferred them to Ramallah, and they live until today in Ramallah as a result of this. So all of this has shown that the results of the elections are not going to be actually withheld. So even the idea of the elections producing individuals who represent the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory, the West Bank and Gaza only, including East Jerusalem, this has not been possible. So this, of course, brings out questions about how are we going to ensure that the new elections will actually be respected by both the Palestinian leadership, but also by the internationals. But this is not the only legitimacy problem. The other legitimacy problem concerns the representation of the whole Palestinian people, not only in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, but in all of historic Palestine and in the diaspora. And maybe here I would like to just very quickly describe how the representation of Palestinians has changed over the years and what have been the different phases and what are we looking at today. So in 1948, the first Palestinian state was declared, actually, and the first Palestinian government was formed. That government was called the All Palestine Government, Hukumat Umum Palestine. And this government basically claimed representing the whole Palestinian people, or hoped to represent the whole Palestinian people, although it had limitations because it did not rule anything except Gaza Strip under Egyptian administration. So it had limited authority and limited representation, although it theoretically said that it represented all of Palestine and every Palestinian. After the death, if I may say, of the All Palestine government, the Palestine Liberation Organization, known as PLO, as an acronym, was established in 1964. And this was basically the alternative of the All Palestine government, recognizing the gap that existed at the time. And the Palestine Liberation Organization had a Palestinian, they had a council and an executive committee. So its council is supposed to also represent all of the Palestinian people. And the executive committee is supposed to be elected by this council. Obviously, unfortunately, the council has never been, the PLC has never been elected. There are supposed to be elections, but they always said that these elections were impossible to happen. So it has been selected through different ways, forming basically the Palestinian political parties that existed and continue to exist until today, as well as other independent individuals forming this PLC. And then in 1988, the PLO declared a new declaration of statehood. So it's the second declaration of statehood in our history. And then in the 90s, in the early 90s, the Palestinian Authority was introduced. And the Palestinian Authority was supposed to be a 5-year organ that represented and dealt with some of the domestic issues in the West Bank and Gaza, unfortunately excluding East Jerusalem in terms of jurisdiction, although including them as voters. So this Palestinian Authority has a legislative council, which acts as a parliament, and it has an executive authority, which is the president and the ministers and the ministers, etc. Recently, the Palestinian Authority has also, because the Palestinian Authority and the leadership of the PLO have decided to act more as a state, joining treaties, acting more as a state, confirming the statehood, let's say, that was declared in 1988. But at the same time, the Palestinian Authority and the state of Palestine have merged in a certain way. So the ministers of the Palestinian Authority have been the ministers of the state, and basically Palestine, as it appears in the international law point of view, is represented by the same Palestinian Authority. And this here poses also a question about how are we going to look at the PLO? And of course, the Legislative Council members become automatically, since 1996, members of the PLC. However, and although we also know that the presidential decree decided to include some sort of selection of the PLC members. I'm not sure if it will be elections. It's not really obvious until today how this selection will happen. Are we going to have elections outside Palestine, I mean in the diaspora, or are we going to also select? And if we're going to select, how are we going to select? And who is going to select? This is, I think, a question that we need to know the answer of. But this whole thing also poses a very big question on legitimacy. Are we only and focusing now on a legislative council and presidential elections for the Palestinian Authority / State of Palestine, which is under occupation, and not only occupation, it's under an apartheid regime that has succeeded to a great extent in dividing the Palestinian lands and Palestinian communities into different separate communities that cannot even cooperate or meet or see each other. There is Gaza Strip, there is the West Bank, and the Israeli occupation and apartheid regime is continuing to colonize the West Bank. So what are we exactly voting for? Are we only voting for this Palestinian Authority or state which is functioning under an apartheid regime, limited in what it can actually, in the way it can exercise its sovereignty? Or are we also voting for, whoever is going to vote, are we voting for a new blood in the Palestine liberation project? In my opinion, what we need is not only running, although that's very important, I don't deny, we still need to run our daily issues in the West Bank and Gaza. That's important. However, that's not enough. We need to revisit our liberation strategies and to strategize for what liberation means and how we're going to get there. And unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be what this election might lead to.
Thank you, Munir, for your comment. The sort of the historical trajectory that you've described really sort of sets in place this sort of a precedent for why these elections are wrought with crises of legitimacy. Who are we talking about? Who is voting? Who will actually represent the Palestinian people? Where are these Palestinian people? And within all of this, where is liberation? Diana, you also have told us you've been cautiously optimistic about these elections in our discussions, and I think as we all are. So on the one hand, you believe that these elections should take place, but you're also wary of certain realities. You've described some of them in your first answer by talking about Abbas's stifling of the electoral process. But can you tell us more about some of these sort of actual on-the-ground realities and limitations that we are seeing now and over the next few months when it comes to the elections? And specifically, what do you think we should keep in mind as we monitor the elections and anticipate something new, if anything?
Thanks, Nadim. Yeah, look, I'm somebody who believes that movements don't grow without having some type of change. And the change in our case, we've been, the essence of our struggle has been a struggle to be able to speak on our own behalves, and to be able to determine our own lives. That's the essence, the core of self-determination. And so in that regard, I'm somebody who very much believes that in order for political movements to be able to move forward, that we do need to have some form of change, hopefully through the issue of elections, where we are able to choose our own leaders. That said, my hesitation is plenty, and my skepticism is plenty as well. On the one hand, just to echo what Munir was saying, is like, what are we actually voting for? The applause that we're seeing and the fanfare that Mahmoud Abbas is getting, 15 years too late, by the way, is simply to vote in the new head of the Palestinian Authority, maybe, because I'm not so sure that those elections are actually going to happen, the ones in July, the presidential elections. And as some people would say, it's like changing the chairs on the deck chairs on the Titanic, perhaps. but the real question is, like, what are we actually voting for? And this is where it's become very apparent to me that this isn't going to be an election about ideas. It's not an election about changing the strategy, about really questioning Oslo and asking ourselves whether we should be moving away from that framework, whether it's going to a different framework, whether it's folding the towel in on the Palestinian Authority, whatever it is. This is not what this is about. At this point, it's really all about just changing the faces, or hopefully changing the faces. And so I'm somebody who very much believes that the faces need to be changed. My skepticism is because of the fact that we've seen that there's been such a tight grip to make sure that those faces actually remain. For example, since the announcement of elections, it's been met only with applause on the part of the international community, as it should be. We should have elections. But they've also glossed over all of these measures where we see Mahmoud Abbas doing everything in his power to try to determine the outcome. For example, just 2 days ago, there was an announcement of an elections court being set up, whereby, again, the court gets to determine who is considered a proper candidate, what is considered the proper outcome, and so on. And when you see the path to which the judicial system has gone in Palestine, and how, again, this has been a judicial system that has been tailor-made to make sure that there is no dissent against Abu Mazen, you're rightfully skeptical about the creation of these election courts as well. So, as I was saying, I do believe that we need to have elections. I do believe that we need to have a change in strategy. I do believe we need to have these a voting in of where it is that we want to go. I'm just concerned with the way that these elections are taking shape, because all of that element is being ignored, and instead what's being focused on is who is allowed to run and who's not allowed to run, and how it is that he can stitch it together and tailor make the outcome that he wants. In other words, what he's trying to do is 15 years later, he's trying to justify the lack of victory that he had in 2006. And on that part is incredibly alarming, because it doesn't just work for today, but it's also going to project us forward for many, many years to come. Just as a last word, already we're seeing that the vast majority of people who are under the age of 40 are either not politically affiliated or getting to the place where they don't believe in the political system. And this is not because these people who aren't fired up about Palestine. We are all fired up about Palestine. It's that there's a lack of belief that the system is going to do anything, and that there's the ability to actually change the system or to have an entry point. And this is very, very, very alarming. The only way that I believe that we can move forward is if people are empowered to be able to move forward. And the combination of the lack of ability, of the crushing of dissent over the course of the past 15 years, and what's now going to be a tailor-made election is something that is incredibly terrifying.
Again, for a sobering reality about what really we're talking about when it comes to elections. What we're seeing more and more of in this policy lab is that we're really talking about a sort of a political elite that are essentially paying lip service to certain, sort of stakeholders, let's say, whether it be international donors or the United States or other Western bodies, or whether it be the Israeli regime itself. So we're really not talking about an election season that is truly democratic. We don't even have primaries for the Palestinian people over the next few months to even partake in whoever would end up being on the ballot in May. Munir, you're also cautiously optimistic about the elections, but you have a vision for what these elections could actually look like if they were actually to bring about meaningful change, whereby Palestinians can, in theory, restore their leadership, their representativeness, and ultimately their struggle for liberation. Can you tell us more about what this vision would entail?
Yes. Well, maybe one good thing about elections in general, and here I'm not talking only about the Palestinian elections, but elections in general, is that they push people to start to organize themselves, to start discussing important issues, to start competing for the liking and the appreciation of the people. And I can see that some of this is happening in Palestine today. I can see that people have started to reorganize themselves. Of course, for this to happen, you need to have continuous elections that would not stop, so that people can continue to organize themselves, can continue to plan for political intervention, and not only wait for the season, which comes very rarely, and then start planning. So maybe this is the only good thing about the current elections. However, maybe not the only thing, but the only thing I can see, at least in today. But however, my vision for a better election is not something that I have invented, but is a call that I have heard frequently and for a long time now, from different groups, different lobby groups, and Palestinian movements, to call for the PLC elections as a first step. So to make sure that the Palestinian people everywhere in Palestine and outside Palestine will choose their leadership. In that way, you will know that the Palestinian people, and not only part of the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian people are represented. At the end of the day, the Palestinians in the West Bank, including Jerusalem and Gaza, are only part of the Palestinian people. Of course, it's an important part. It's a part that is living under immediately under the occupation. But of course, what about the people in the diaspora who are refugees, who many of whom long to return to their home? So the first thing that should happen is elections for the PLC, and that would hopefully produce a leadership that will actually represent the Palestinian people better. And this election should be continuous and frequent, not to happen once in a lifetime and then stop, because we need to restore or to create maybe democracy in Palestinian political representation. We need to be able to actually plan for liberation and not continue to live under the status quo of a growing settlement, a continuous transfer and displacement of Palestinians, and living with very, very, very minimal rights, and even not with the same rights. It's not like all Palestinians in the occupied territory have the same rights. Your rights depend on the color of your ID card and the shape of the permit that is given to you by the Israeli occupation authorities. And where you live. So we need to plan for our liberation rather than continue to play along with a game that where we are controlled by the Israeli occupation, but also international donors who open the tap of water of money when they are happy with our conduct and choices, and then close it when they feel that we have gone outside the lines of their what they can accept. So yes, PLC elections as a first step, and later we can, all the other things are important. Of course, I'm not saying the Legislative Council elections are not important. They are, but we need genuine elections that will open up for real change to happen.
Thank you, Munir, and thank you, Diana, for this Very compelling conversation. I think you've brought up a very critical points, but before we turn to trying to synthesize some themes and ideas from the discussion, let's turn to some questions from the audience, which have been coming in quite regularly over the last 30 minutes. I think everyone is also wondering about much of what we've been discussing in terms of what are we really talking about in these elections and what can we actually hope for. So to get into some of these specifics, the first question, Munir, if you don't mind us going right back to you, just because there's so much, let's say that there are so many moving pieces here when we say PLO, PNC, PLC, PA. I mean, this is just at the surface. Could you tell us a bit more? Could you elaborate on how the PLC and the PNC elections are interconnected, and how do they impact one another, if at all?
Yes, they do actually. According to the current design, the PLC, the Palestinian Legislative Council, members will automatically become part of the Palestinian National Council. So they will become automatically PNC members. Now, supposedly, the PNC is the representative of the Palestinian people in general. And that actually means that the PLO and PNC should have some sort of a superior role compared to the PLC, the Legislative Council. Now, this doesn't seem to be the case in practice, because now Palestine is more, as I mentioned earlier, Palestine is more and more acting as a state. And the state of Palestine and the Palestinian Authority, which functions under occupation in 1967 occupied boundaries, basically in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, is actually the state of Palestine somehow. And this will bring about some questions regarding the role of the PLO in general, and the PNC, the National Council, the Palestinian National Council in general. What is going to be the role of this council? Is it going to actually make the strategic decisions? Are they going to be consulted on important issues? Unfortunately, of course, we had no PLC and no active PNC for the past almost 15 years. And all of these authorities that we have mentioned have been only with the hands of a few men, basically. So let's say Palestine wants to join a treaty. It's just a simple decision without consultations. Palestine wants to change a law, a domestic law. It's just a quick exercise of the executive authority in Ramallah. Ministers send something to the president signs it, and that's it. It's a new law. That's it. No need for consultations, no need even for anything, no need for legislative council, no need for parliament. So this has been the case. It has been no PLC, no PNC, nothing. And it has been just a few, mainly men, I would say, who controlled everything in Palestine. Now, if this changes, it will be great. But yes, anyway, I'm not going to repeat what I said earlier, but I hope that this clarified somehow the differences. But at the end of the day, theoretically speaking, the PLO is supposed to be the highest representation of the Palestinian people. It's supposed to be, but it's not functioning like that.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. My microphone button continues to get stuck. Thank you, Munir. Diana, if you don't mind going to you next, also in this kind of context of sort of the messiness of these elections and whether or not what they actually look like when we talk about the moving parts. Can you elaborate on how lists and fronts can actually be formed in the absence of an official party law when it comes to the next few months before the elections?
Well, it's not the next few months. They have to register by the 31st of March, so 20 days. And the reason so there's a cutoff day, which is the 31st of March. That's the day in which all of the candidates have to put forward their names in terms of whether they're going to be running, and the slates have to be formed, etc. So how is it that it's done? So this is the big question. So in general, lists are allowed to be formed when it comes to elections. That hasn't been the problem. This is why, for example, in the 2006 election, we saw the Third Way, which consisted of Salam Fayyad and Hanan Ashrawi coming together on one slate. We also saw the other slate that came together with Mustafa Barghouti and some people from Gaza and so on. So that's not the problem. The bigger problem is that there is no process to be able to actually register a formal political party in Palestine. The political parties that exist are the ones that exist, and that's it. And it's for that reason that by not being able to have a political parties law, it's very difficult to bring in people to do everything from gathering to fundraising to being able to organize together. It's not as simple as saying, well, you have now 20 days, and given that you have 20 days, you can put together a list. Similarly, the fact that there's so many people who are now being excluded, who aren't allowed to run. You know, when you're looking at somebody as a person who works in the Palestinian Authority, a person who potentially wants to run, who's a current employee of the Palestinian Authority, what in effect you're saying to them is you're going to, even if you have to resign first and then run, rather than what would normally happen in other places around the world, which is you win first and then you resign. And it cuts out a significant livelihood for some people. So the hesitation of not being able to come in and having all of these years of developing and forming political movements, getting those political movements that then have the necessary funds to pay the $20,000 fee, to then having the assurance that yes, these people potentially will be able to garner a seat and then can resign from their jobs. I mean, it's a lot of instability and insecurity, and that is the whole point of it. Is that it's designed to make sure that the status quo remains the status quo. That we know who exactly the players are. We know who's going to be running. We know who's not going to be running, and we try to limit it, and at the same time try to label them as free and fair elections, and also try to label it as somehow getting a stamp of approval from the international community. So that's sort of the problem in a nutshell.
Thank you, Diana. Munir, I'd like to get back to you to speak specifics again about East Jerusalemites, especially given what happened in 2006 with revoking residency permits of East Jerusalemites who voted for Hamas. Could you tell us, given this reality and given the threat that something like this will likely happen again, what does participation of East Jerusalemites actually look like in these elections?
Thank you for this question. In fact, what happened in after 2006 was that Israel revoked the residency statuses of the elected members, not those who voted for them. So the elected members of the three ones who belonged to Hamas, as well as a fourth person who was appointed in that government, in the first government after the elections, as the Minister of Jerusalem Affairs. So these four persons, they have had their residency revoked, and later on, actually, Israel legislated a law according to which you might lose your residency status. It will be revoked by the Ministry of Interior if you breach your allegiance to the State of Israel, even though, of course, Palestinians are not citizens of the State of Israel in Jerusalem. I mean, they are not citizens, and there is no such thing as an allegiance to the State of Israel. But they invented this term for us, or applied it on the Palestinian population, and they took advantage of the elections and the outcome of the elections in order to create more laws that according to which they can revoke more residencies from Palestinians, and they have used it outside the scope of elections also during the last few years. Now regarding Palestinians and the elections, of course, it's very important to say that when Palestinians participate in this election, they are actually participating in electing an authority that has no contribution to their lives. So we are allowed to vote for the Legislative Council, but whatever laws that the Legislative Council legislates do not apply in Jerusalem because Jerusalem is not under the authority of the Palestinian Authority until now. Also, whatever the president decides or whatever does not really apply. But that's not only the problem. Israel has also greatly restricted any PLO or Palestinian Authority presence in Jerusalem. You are not allowed to organize a talk, for example, in Jerusalem, and host a Palestinian minister or a Palestinian or a PLO official or whatever in Jerusalem. So on the one hand, Israel has accepted over the past two elections, 2006 and 1996, to allow Palestinians to vote in the post offices in Jerusalem, actually, for a limited number, and the rest of Palestinians from Jerusalem had to go to areas in the West Bank to vote. And Palestinians in Jerusalem have voted, actually, and they feel that even though, in general, these elections don't apply to them greatly, and even though the Palestinian Authority is unable to make any contributions to their lives, and doesn't even have, and that's something that Palestinians in Jerusalem always complain about, doesn't even have plans to or budgets to make serious contributions in Jerusalem. Nonetheless, Palestinians have voted in the elections, regardless of whether they actually voted in the post office, the Israeli post office that is in Jerusalem, or they had to go to other areas in the West Bank to vote outside the Jerusalem area. So yes, in Jerusalem, it's always a difficult question. Israel does not like the idea of Palestinians in Jerusalem voting, but at the same time, that was part of the Oslo Agreement. It happens, and but with no positive influence on our lives at the end of the day.
Thank you, Munir. I'd like to try to combine two questions that are sort of thematically similar when it comes to opposition to Abbas. Well, certainly we've debunked the idea that these are in any way truly democratic elections. But this is to you, Diana. What does political opposition actually look like in these elections if Hamas and the PFLP aren't part of it? They've been warned by Israel, as our guest has indicated, not to participate in the elections. And what about Dahlan? Is Dahlan a viable opponent now or later? He now has strong ties with the UAE, and he's sort of in a place to supply Gaza with vaccinations. So what is, I mean, to the extent that opposition is truly possible, whether now or in the future, how can these elections actually lay the groundwork for shifting political parties or shifting actual leadership?
That's two very good questions. Look, on the first part of it, of Hamas and PFLP, yes, the Israelis are playing a very ugly game. Not only, by the way, not only when it comes to Jerusalem, but also all throughout for Palestinian life. Their whole the point of it is to try to limit Palestinian participation and to try to make sure that the Palestinian Authority is just a reflection of of Mahmoud Abbas, because this has worked for them for quite some time. So yes, there's definitely that. But that being said, Hamas has already announced that they're not going to put forward a candidate when it comes to the presidential elections. And they've also indicated in several different ways that they don't want to be the ones that are leading any longer. That it's very much a question of wanting to get the legitimacy, but that they don't want to be the ones in charge for the most part, because they saw exactly what happened when they did win the election. It's created some of the worst 15 years for Palestinians because of the fact that people have not accepted the outcome of that election. And then, of course, it creates its own internal dynamic of people not being happy with the way that Hamas is governed. So all of that being said, their opposition is very narrow in scope. Again, this is not, as I mentioned from the beginning, this is not an opposition that's talking about the big ideas about what are we doing in terms of strategy, where are we going, how are we actually moving towards liberation of Palestine. But it's instead a question of trying to get rid of or perhaps change the faces of the current Palestinian Authority. And that's why these other lists, that's why Abu Mazen has taken with such threat the presence of these other lists. For example, the Nasser Qudwa list with rumors of Marwan Barghouti and others. And the reason that he's taken that with such seriousness is because this is an internal Fatah list. And again, this is one of the reasons that he was, as of today, kicked out of Fatah. So in short, what we're looking at is, when it comes to Dahlan, I don't know. I mean, he has not come out and said that he's going to run in these elections. If anything, it's been just a call to actually have the elections. But that being said, I think this is very much a question of them, the people within Fatah fighting for what Fatah is and what it actually means, with just a little bit of coming in from the other elements of the PFLP and Hamas. And so this is why I think it's very important for us to keep our eyes on what these elections are truly about and what they're not about. This is not an election regarding the liberation of Palestine. This is not an election regarding future strategies. What this is an election about is about removing or potentially removing Mahmoud Abbas. But in the process of removing him, what is it that's going to then be created in its place?
Munir, I'd like to thank you, Diana. Just in the 5 or so minutes, since we have so many questions coming in, I'd like to maybe have us go a bit over, just till about 6:05 p.m. This is, we're speaking a local time here in Amman. I'd like to just ask one question to Munir that might be sort of out of the sort of the parameters of this conversation, because it's a huge topic. But one of our audience members asked a question that I find very compelling. Since the PLO has become something so symbolic, just in terms of its representation of the Palestinian people, that it really is largely a symbolic body at this point. If the PLO is to be representative of the Palestinians globally, and in terms of the Palestinian diaspora, and given that it is so ineffectual and so politically sort of useless in ways, what could replace the PLO in theory if we are to speak about representing Palestinians globally? It's very theoretical, but if you have the answer, you might be able to.
It's very theoretical, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer for this. So I'm going to comment on this question and not necessarily answer it. as I mentioned in my very quick overview of Palestinian representation, the PLO is already an alternative to another body that existed that represented the Palestinian people, the first state of Palestine and the All Palestine government. Unfortunately, the first state of Palestine and All Palestine government failed to continue and to survive under a lot of political pressure from Arabs, from non-Arabs, from the international community. It did not recognize Israel. It was impossible for it to recognize Israel. So anyway, it could not succeed. It did not continue. And then the PLO came to fill this vacuum of representation. 2 years after basically the official fall of the All Palestine government. So it came to fill this gap and to say that the Palestinians are represented by a certain body, which is the PLO. And the Palestinian people have invested a lot of energy throughout the history since the creation of the PLO, to keep it, to sustain it, to enrich it, they fought with it together under its banner. And everybody saw that this organization is the representative of the Palestinian people. Now, why would we need an alternative is my question now to the question that you asked me. Why wouldn't it be better to focus on reforming the PLO? It needs reformation. It needs very fundamental reformation, actually. But if we focus on the reform of the PLO, that would probably save us time of having another vacuum and waiting for another 40 years until we have a new representative that might work and might not. So that's, in my opinion, what we need. But also we need the PLO once it is reformed. And I'm hoping that the elections, if elections happen, like if PLO elections happen, that this might help in reforming the PLO eventually. And if this happens, then the PLO should actually start working on liberating Palestine, because I feel that this project is not being worked on strategically. We've been focusing on the two-state solution over the past few decades, saying that we need a Palestinian state in the boundaries of 1967. We imagined international law accepts only that, which is not necessarily true. I don't think it's true. I think a one-state solution is also a good option, and it complies with international law, certainly. Therefore, we have that option. We can start thinking about our future more strategically and not continue with mantras that we have been repeating for the past few decades, just because the international community told us this is the way we should think. So, but you cannot start this strategic thinking if you do not have, a free PLO that can actually think for itself. The Palestinian Authority under occupation, unfortunately, is not free. We've seen many revolutionary decisions that they've made, even during 2020, that they did not manage to follow up on. They had to retreat. So, and I understand, at the end of the day, they have to do a lot of things, pay salaries to employees and things like that. There are practical pressures on the Palestinian Authority under occupation. So we do need something that is stronger and not control. So yeah, this is my weird answer.
It's certainly not a strange answer. It's a tall order to ask you to answer who should represent the Palestinian people globally within a few minutes. Thank you, Munir. Diana, I'd like to end the discussion with a question to you. This is also to do with the broader international spectrum. As we mentioned during the first half, there are international stakeholders, and certainly the United States, international donors have a lot to say. Let's say have a lot of influence on these elections. What do you envision to be given also that the United States, now we have the Biden administration, things might actually be shifting in certain, in let's say possibly more positive or regressive directions if we just go back to the status quo of Oslo. Do you believe that given the new international climate, given the regional climate and normalization deals, that these will have any impact on whether or not these elections come out with any significant change? But even in the longer term, do these regional and international shifts have sort of any significant potentials for what we see in terms of political leadership for the Palestinians?
My turn to have mic problems. Okay. It's been very interesting watching okay, let me step back. So back in 2005, when we had the presidential elections, and then in 2006 when we had the general elections, at the time the big international move was, should Hamas be allowed to participate in the elections? And I recall very clearly when President Bush was at the meeting, when he said, I think that they should be able to participate in the elections. I believe that they'll be dealt with at the ballot box. And what he meant was, he had done his calculations, and I think he thought that that Fatah was going to sail. In fact, Fatah thought that they were going to sail through and that they were going to win the elections, and of course they didn't. But what was interesting is the aftermath of that is what has led to where we are today. The fact that the international community failed to refuse to recognize the outcome, sadly, with Canada being the first state that the first country saying that they weren't going to recognize the outcome of the elections, and then moving forward. And so if you fast forward to today, unfortunately, we're still having that very same conversation, that we still see that many of the groups within the Israel lobby are pushing to make sure that Hamas is not allowed to run in the election. And despite how tailored this election actually is in terms of the outcome, there's still a push to not include them in the electoral process, even though there's Israeli elections happening on the 23rd of this month. Many of the parties that are running in those Israeli elections, their platforms are in no way comparable. They're much worse than anything that anybody could possibly imagine coming out of Hamas, with parties that are openly calling for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And so I think that a lot of the international reaction is going to be based on how much the outcome is going to be in favor of Hamas or not in favor of Hamas. And this is actually a very scary proposition, that we're still, here we are 15 years after the fact, still talking about whether Hamas is a legitimate political movement within the Palestinian polity, whether you like them or dislike them. The fact that we're still having this question, and the fact that we still see that international pressure is brought to bear on making sure that their participation is actually quite limited is quite scary. And it just shows you just how much the international community, that our liberation is not going to come through the hands of the international community, but it's going to come through our own hands. It's not for them to decide who our representatives are. It's for us to decide who our representatives are. And I'm just afraid that as we get closer to the elections, that more and more of this pressure is going to be exerted to even further tailor the elections even narrower, so that we're really only talking about Fatah elections.
So thank you both so much for this incredibly enriching and enlightening discussion. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I think what you've both really brought to light for us is the sobering reality of what these elections actually are, what they could be, and what they will certainly not be. This is not a free and democratic general election that the Palestinians should ultimately benefit from. This is, in many ways, sort of, as I said earlier, sort of a performance by Abbas to pay lip service to international stakeholders, to perform sort of the semblance of democracy, the semblance of representation and change for Palestinian civil society. I think we've also discussed just how important legitimacy in terms of representativeness is in this election system, especially given the geographic expansiveness of the Palestinian people, whether in the diaspora in 1948, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, or certainly in Gaza. I like the idea, Munir, of reforming rather than replacing different representative bodies, just so that we save time. So hopefully what we will see coming out from these elections is something like that, something that actually pushes us and pushes Palestinian leadership and in a more radical direction in terms of change, and that actually gives the Palestinians a bit of hope moving forward. So I'd like to thank you both for highlighting such important realities about these long-awaited Palestinian general elections. We look on with cautious optimism as the weeks and months progress, and we continue towards securing, we continue to work towards securing for Palestinians a political leadership that prioritizes their fundamental rights and that upholds their struggle for liberation. I'd also like to thank you, our audience all over the world, for joining us today and for submitting your engaging thoughts and questions. But before we sign off, I'd just like to remind everyone that Policy Labs are a crowdfunded program of Al-Shabaka's, so we do rely on your continued support. If you are able to donate, please do so by clicking on the donate button or link that should now appear on your screens. So thank you all. It was an honor to host you both as my first Policy Lab, and thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you, Nadim. Thank you, Munir. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, both Nadim and Diana.
Thank you.